So hello, everyone. My name is Nia Johnson, and I'm a PhD student from the University of Michigan in the EEB department. And I would like to welcome you to the 17th Annual Early Career Scientist Symposium entitled Racial Justice and Anti-Racist Research in EEB. Originally funded by Nancy Walls, the goal of this symposium is to highlight some very important topics and to provide a space for the EEB community to think imaginatively about the future of our discipline. The Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at acknowledges that the university's origins in the land grant from the Anishinaabe and the Wadadat peoples. We further acknowledge that our university stands, like almost all property in the US, on lands obtained generally in ways from Indigenous peoples. And in addition to our research on the ecology and evolutionary biology from has benefited and continues to benefit from the access to this land originally gained through the exploitation of others. Knowing where we live and where we work does not change the past, but through understanding the ongoing consequences of this past, we can empower our teachings, research, and outreach to create a future that supports humans flourishing and justice for all individuals. We would also like to give a special thanks to our co-sponsors, the CEW Plus Irma Watson Grant Program Fund and the Rackham Faculty Allies Diversity Grant. And with that, we would also like to thank everyone for joining us today. We have some really amazing speakers, and I will let Sammy introduce our first speaker.
Awesome, thanks Nia, and hello everybody. Again, my name is Sammy, and it's my pleasure today to introduce our very first speaker of the day, Dr. Sabrina Shirazi. Thank you so much for being here. Hello. So Dr. Shirazi is a postdoctoral researcher with Dr. Courtney Hoffman in the laboratories of molecular anthropology and microbiome research at the University of Oklahoma. Before this, Sabrina received her PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Dissertation research was about studying past ecosystems and human actions with environmental and ancient DNA, which sounds extremely cool and interesting. So as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Shirazi is leading a collaborative project with the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, the Nature Conservancy, and in conjunction with the Santa Ynez Band of the Chumash Indians to explore links between ecosystem restoration, conservation, and archaeology on the Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve. Dr. Shirazi's research and interests blend anthropological, ecological, and conservation questions, as well as narratives about human relationships with their environment. In this work, she has developed innovative research questions on reconstructing ecological history and indigenous lifeways using non-invasive environmental DNA approaches. Dr. Shirazi has authored research articles in the Journal of Archaeological Science, Environmental Archaeology, Ecology and Evolution, Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution, and more. Notably, Dr. Shirazi has also co-authored a paper about anti-racist interventions to transform EEB departments. And this was published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution in 2021. So today, Dr. Shirazi will be presenting a talk entitled Ecological Research on Stolen Indigenous Land, in which she will discuss her current collaborations, the importance of boundaries, trust and transparency, and co-designing research in light of ongoing discussions in anti-racist research. So during this talk, if any members of the audience have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat and we'll get to them after the presentation during the Q&A session. So with that, Dr. Shirazi, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited for your talk. And with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sammy, for that introduction, and Nia for providing the basis for this series and giving that land acknowledgement. And thank you everyone who's signed in and watching. As Sammy said, my name is Sabrina Shirazi, currently a postdoctoral fellow between a few institutions, which I'll get into in just a second. My talk today is ecological research on stolen land, and I'll go over a few projects that I'm working on at the moment with the Chumash on Chumash land. And just to give the land acknowledgement of this tribe, the Chumash is comprised of 8 tribes. They were decimated in late 1700s, mainly by disease brought in by the Spanish missions. And today the tribe's cultures have been revitalized and they continue to concentrate on education, health, culture, and conservation to ensure a vibrant future for future generations to come. And I'm speaking from Queens, New York, which is on unceded Munsee and Lenape lands. And just a brief overview of where I'm coming into this from so you kind of understand my positionality. I'm currently on a postdoc from the Nature Conservancy to the Smithsonian, transferred to the University of Oklahoma because of difficulties with federal funding. And the aim of my postdoc is to negotiate desires of both the Nature Conservancy and the Chumash to inform ongoing and future archaeological work, conservation and management work. And my project is to do this all using environmental DNA. And my background personally is in archaeology and molecular biology. I've done some work with the Chumash before this. And I come into this project working with archaeologists who have a long-term working relationship with the tribe. And also the Nature Conservancy is building a partnership. So I'm part of a larger team that's been working. And for all of these projects, one of the key issues that's important to consider at the start of the project is data sovereignty. And before I jump into my work, I just want to preface it by acknowledging the misalignment that exists between movements towards open data that exists within academia, like those of NSF and NIH, and Indigenous interests of data sovereignty. Making data publicly available is of best interest to many in academia, but not necessarily to individual tribes who want to control the information that's being generated and shared about their people. And later in my talk, I'll discuss how this interface has come up in my own work. And throughout this talk, I'm only going to highlight aspects of Chumash culture that are relevant to my research. And all of this research has been approved by the Chumash. I've included a link here if you want to learn more about them from them directly. And all of these issues that I'm going over today are based in the fact that Indigenous land was stolen. And just, I'm sure many of you know this, but just to give a preface of this, stolen or unceded land refers to land that was never signed over to the current people claiming ownership of it. And the means of land ownership being handed over may have been by force, fraud, or perjury. And pretty much everywhere that anyone is doing research in the US is on stolen land. And I just have two historical graphics here for you to kind of internalize that. All of my research is done in California. And as I said, working with the Chumash, who are down in the Santa Barbara, Los Angeles region. And all of my work is focusing on this point, which many people know as Point Conception. And at the moment, this area is owned by the Nature Conservancy, recently acquired through donors Jack and Laura Dangermond. And this Point Conception in Chumash language is known as Kumquak or Humquak, depending on the dialect. And across this preserve, so everything will be focusing on this preserve pretty much from now on. On this preserve, there's over 50 archaeological sites that we know of. And each of the points on the left are the approximate locations of these sites, and they're colored by their date. And this date was obtained by radiocarbon dating shellfish. And you can see that there's records of the Chumash people on this land for the past 9,000 years. And there's this kind of incredible record on this preserve. There's very important village sites who the direct ancestors of the chiefs of those villages are known and living in the area today. And as we look at this map of all of the archaeological sites, we can see that the majority are along the coast. And there likely would have been many, many more of these coastal sites, but many of them are eroding, as you can see here. This is one of the sites, referred often as a midden, also as a cultural space. And erosion on the cliffs is known about. Some communities or some tribes are comfortable with this. They feel that this is the natural process of these archaeological sites, and they're very comfortable with the sites being over time lost. Other tribes are more interested in kind of documenting what is there before it's naturally dropped into the ocean. And these middens or cultural spaces are sites where people would have deposited lots of both biological and non-biological objects, like the scraps of their food. It could have been lithics or pottery. Sometimes even human burials occur within these sites. And these sites are kind of amalgamations of a lot of historical, ecological, and cultural information. And when we zoom into these sites, you can see that there's, just from this one zoom in, there's a great amount of biodiversity that we can learn about from just individual middens. Like in this picture alone, there's several different species of shellfish, and someone that's actually a shellfish biologist, unlike myself, could probably zoom in and pick out many more. And there's also bones that come out. Here, this is a rib from some species of bird sticking out. And just to highlight the amount of ecological and cultural data that can come from these sites, I want to give you an example of just vertebrae that have come out of these sites. From one day looking at middens, we find sardine vertebra and large shark vertebra, which really highlights the skill set of the Chumash people in their fisheries. And also, when people are going through these middens, they've also found vertebra that have been turned into beads, which is really showing you the skill set in terms of the biodiversity they were targeting in fishing, and also the cultural aspects of how all of the remains were being used. From these archaeological sites, we, as I say, build this large view of the biodiversity was being gathered by the Chumash people. And additionally, when we look at ethnographic reports, some of the information, or some of the species that come up in ethnographic reports we will see in the archaeological sites, and some of the species won't come up. And a lot of the species that we have records of from some of the ethnographic reports from early Chumash, they are organisms that don't have tissues that would preserve in an archaeological site. For example, octopus or lobster. An octopus sure has a beak in it, which might preserve longer than the rest of the tissue, but the beak is very fragile, and these types of tissues won't be preserved in an archaeological site like a midden that we could see thousands of years later. So since we're not seeing everything in the archaeological sites, and this is just looking at animals, not even plants, since we're not seeing everything in the archaeological sites, and we know that ethnographic reports are very limited, we wonder what else was being gathered by the Chumash and what else was in the area at the time, because as I'll get into a bit later, these archaeological sites are a great resource for kind of looking at the historical archaeology or the historical ecology of a region. So my research is coming in and bringing in environmental DNA to see if we can kind of pick up what other species were being gathered by the Chumash, and to just get kind of methodological understanding of what is environmental DNA good at detecting and versus ethnographic and archaeological. And just a brief overview for those that may not be familiar with environmental DNA. This refers to DNA that's shed by all organisms, meaning bacteria, fungi, plants, and animals, and preserved in water, soil, or air. So my research will go back to these middens, and I'll extract small amounts of soil. And just because of the way that environmental DNA is processed, the amount of soil that actually goes into a DNA extraction is very, very little, which makes it a great tool for performing non-invasive research. And I'll take this soil, and then from there go into figuring out what DNA is in there. And speaking about DNA and working with Indigenous tribes, the history of scientists and specifically genetic researchers working with Indigenous tribes is not at all clean and has left a very understandable legacy of mistrust. Ethical and legal oversteppings from scientists often occurred from negligence of explaining data gathered, the analyses they planned to do, and the scientific methods they were using. Tribes have been faced with studies challenging their origins, and they've straight up been lied to and exploited. So it's extremely important to be open about the methods, the type of data that we're gathering early on, and for researchers to be cautious and aware of how the specific data that they generate could be harmful to a group of people. And there are databases that have come up and people working towards making data publishable in a form that's totally controlled by the indigenous tribes. An approach that I personally have used in the past was removing any human DNA aligned data that was sequenced by bycatch, meaning I wasn't trying to sequence human DNA, but it came up, and removing that before it was made publicly available. And with this project, the approach that I'm taking is to choose methods that avoid human DNA possibly being observed, and explaining the methods in detail to the tribe and asking them what worries they might have. So the approach that I'm using, which some of you may be familiar with, is metabarcoding. And this approach is taking the soil, extracting the DNA, and then I target different genes to amplify with PCR, and I only look at those regions of the DNA. And those regions will only be able to differentiate species. So I can say this is a lobster or a tiger shark or a certain species of grass. And human DNA could come up, but there's no way for me to know if it's my own human DNA. So while I'm doing the analysis, the first step is to throw this out as assumed contamination. And I took this project proposal to the Chumash Elders Council, and I explained what we can learn. I gave them a description of the methods, and they were very excited about what could be learned, but quickly this idea of data sharing came up, and there was obvious discomfort with publishing the study. And from the academic, or from my own funding point, I have to publish, which kind of created a interesting conversation and thought piece to work through. And we kind of left that to the side. Yes, they're not interested in publishing, but I would kind of have to. And we continued to talk about ways of sharing the data that they would be interested in. And at this point, they told me about a museum that they are currently making that they would be interested in having some of these results put into. And as we were talking about it, they were asking what I would do with any leftover soil. And generally, when I have leftover soil, it'll sit in the freezer with other projects or eventually be discarded. And for them, I told them I could bring it back to the original sites. I'll know site from site what it is, or I can potentially take the soil, since it's already been taken from the archaeological sites, and bring it to your museum and make some type of large graphic about here's the soils from our ancestors' sites and here's what we've learned from it. And after this meeting, it was a bit of radio silence for about 2 months. And just last week, the Elders Council gave permission and excitement, or expressed excitement in moving forward with this. So this will be starting up very soon. And now jumping into projects that are ongoing and coming back to the idea of Middens, where I was discussing that not only do they provide great archaeological and cultural knowledge, they also are a storehouse of historical ecological knowledge, telling us about biodiversity in a location throughout the past. And one example of a question that we have about species presence throughout the past is, were steelhead trout present on this preserve and when? So this is a species that isn't coming up in traditional archaeological excavations, but is recorded in an ethnographic histories of having been present in the area. And we know that steelhead trout were present, or are present currently, in the Santianez river system, which is just outside of the preserve, but they're currently locally endangered. And now, before the archaeological project was working with the Chumash Elders Committee, and now these projects are working with the Chumash Environmental Committee. And this committee is very interested in generally preserving endangered species. So they're interested in knowing, were these trout there in the past and are they there now? And there's some reports of the trout in the Santianez River, but we don't know about the trout within the Jack and Laura Dangermond Preserve. And within the preserve, if you can see it kind of going east to west along the center, there's this creek, Coloma Creek. And there's reasons to believe these trout were there in the past. We don't believe they're there now, but we're not sure. So my environmental DNA project is coming in and sampling water and sediment throughout this creek to monitor for steelhead in the system. And this is going to be a long-term monitoring project in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy, because throughout this creek, there's many barriers to fish passage. Like under all of these bridges, there's many dams where the fish couldn't jump. So the Nature Conservancy will be removing these dams, and this long-term monitoring project with environmental DNA is providing the basis to both figure out if steelhead trout are there and to track potential success in reintroducing them from restoration efforts. And now jumping gears into another project, another management project with both the Nature Conservancy and the Chumash Environmental Committee is looking at wild pigs. Wild pigs are known to create disturbance across really anywhere they live, and we see that across the preserve. And the preserve is interested in removing pigs because of the disturbance they're causing. And the Chumash Environmental Committee is also interested in learning more about the wild pig behavior to see, are the pigs on the preserve harming endangered and native species? And additionally, in the cultural aspect, the Chumash are interested in bringing back their indigenous hunting strategies to the preserve. And if this project generated information about the wild pigs consuming endangered species, this could present further support for them working towards bringing their hunting back to the land. And specifically, I wish I had a better picture than this one to show. The pigs on this preserve are known to be running across the beaches and kind of rummaging through kelp beds. And this has been observed previously, but it's never been documented. People don't know what they're eating in the kelp beds. So what we'll be doing is taking pig scat and metabarcoding it to figure out, what are the pigs on the preserve eating? Are they eating endangered species? Should they be totally removed from the preserve? Is this further evidence or further support for Chumash traditional hunting strategies being brought to the preserve? So in summary, I have these 3 projects going on at the moment. Some more may be starting up, 1 archaeological and 2 monitoring. And through this collaboration, I've been learning a lot about data sovereignty, how to work through kind of the intersection between desires for public data and indigenous controlled data. And I'm looking forward to figuring out the different ways that the Chumash are interested in maybe sharing or not sharing the research that we both find joint interest in. And I just have some resources here that I think are great for anyone interested in. The top 3 are the data governance, the link to the anti-racism paper that I was a co-author on that Sam mentioned. And on the bottom right specifically here is an awesome guide on kind of the various boundaries and difficulties and issues that may come up when trying to work with a First Nation or Indigenous tribe. Because yes, it's great to be able to work with them, but it's not always necessarily easy to be able to contact them. And you could be an inconvenience. Any of us could be an inconvenience to contacting them. So this is a great resource that really goes over that. And I'd like to thank my collaborators, my advisors, Dr. Hoffman and Dr. Rick, and some other collaborators, and I can take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that talk, Sabrina. I can moderate the Q&A, and if anyone has a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat. But I will start us off with a question if that's all right with you. So I think this is absolutely amazing opportunity to be able to collaborate with so many different organizations, and especially the Chumash board of the Elder Council and their kind of ecological group. And I'm wondering, how did this project come about? Is this like a project that you conceptualized and then brought to these groups, or was this conceptualized within the tribe or the Nature Conservancy, or kind of how did it come to be, and specifically how did you end up working on this?
So it came to be from a random donor to the Nature Conservancy interested in giving funds towards increasing Chumash involvement with the Nature Conservancy. And the Nature Conservancy got this funds, and my advisor, Dr. Torben Rick, who has been working with the Chumash his entire career, kind of got this grant proposing to do environmental DNA research in addition to isotopic research and other excavations. And then I came in as that postdoc, and the specific projects using environmental DNA I came up with, but I came in with the framework of figuring out how we could use environmental DNA in projects that are of interest to the tribe.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you. So we do have a question in the chat. This is from Catherine Badgley. She says, very interesting, Sabrina. Are there any of the Chumash people interested in learning the field or laboratory methods that you are using? In other words, becoming direct collaborators?
Yes. So I didn't even get time to speak about it, but in my project, I have funding to be bringing several students with me, both into the field and actually to Oklahoma to process the sediments. And also there's funding to be putting on a STEM workshop for any Chumash people or local people interested in. And as I was mentioning at the end, it can be difficult to get a meeting with the elders, and then it can take time to get a response. So now that the projects are able to start, those are the next things that we'll be kind of formulating. But that's one of the things that I'm most excited about.
Thank you. So I have a question about kind of your methods too, and I haven't worked with environmental DNA at all, but I'm just amazed that there's ancient environmental DNA that can still be sequenced and show up in samples. And I'm wondering how, out of all the DNA that kind of was there in past history, how much of it is actually like usable? And is there anything you might be missing because it's been like degraded or anything like that? Coming from someone who knows very, very little about DNA work or environmental DNA or metabarcoding. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but those are all very valid points. So researchers have gotten ancient environmental DNA up to 400,000 years old. And those were in very specific settings up in the Arctic. I've personally worked on soils up to 50,000 years old, also up in the Arctic. And the Arctic is kind of like our freezer in the molecular labs. They're perfect for preserving DNA, and that's why they've preserved DNA that long. On a California coast where it's humid and hot and a lot of sun exposure, the DNA breaks down. Sun exposure will literally break down DNA, and moisture in the air supports microbial action, and microbes will eat the DNA because DNA is just sugars. So DNA preservation is definitely going to be lower here compared to somewhere like the Arctic. I personally worked on Middens, Chumash Middens environmental DNA stuff 10 years ago, and the methods were not there to be able to be doing it yet. A collaborator of mine recently has worked on Middens from the Channel Islands and got preliminary promising reviews or results. And especially over the last 3-4 years, the methods have really improved to get the most DNA out so that we're able to find needles in haystacks, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very cool. And we have a few questions in the chat. So this one says, what is the relationship between the Chumash people and their neighboring indigenous people? Are their attitudes towards natural resources similar?
That's also a great point. So when I say the Chumash, there's actually 8 tribal bands, and the only tribal band that I personally am directly in contact with right now is the Santinez band. My advisors have worked with all of the tribal bands, and just within the Santinez band, there's differences in views and what should be doing. And then when you bring that out to the different Chumash bands, there's also differences in views. So yes, there's definitely differences in viewpoints of what should be done between all the different tribes and even between individual elders on the elders committee.
Wow. Yeah, I can imagine that can be a long process, but definitely worthwhile. So this next question is from Katrina Monsterman. Katrina says, thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm wondering if your work in collaboration with Indigenous knowledge from the Chumash has provided any information about the historical populations of sea otters in the area.
My personal work has not, but Dr. Torben Rick, my advisor, who has been working with this, has been very involved in bringing any sea otter bones that come up in Middens or any archaeological sites. I believe all of the work on this area's sea otter populations is done, if you look up Dr. Torben Rick, Dr. Bob Wayne at UCLA, and Jim Estes at UC Santa Cruz.
Thank you. All right, this next question says, could you say something about the archaeological evidence with respect to agricultural versus fishing and hunting?
So the Chumash were hunter-gatherers, definitely. Interestingly, we don't know too much about it yet, but during the missions period, the Chumash were actually put, at least in this area on the preserve, they were put in charge of a winery, and they ran this winery, which was pretty awesome. And we're starting to learn more about that and what they were doing, but they were really jumping into winery at that point.
So next, did you discuss the disposition of any of the human DNA you might find?
Yes, so when I spoke to the elders, this was both in the report that I sent to them before I met with them and in the meeting. I told them there could be Chumash human DNA in these sites just because humans were living there, and also because we know that there's human remains in some of the sites. And I expressed to them and explained a bit of the methods of the approach that I'm personally taking. If the DNA comes out as Chumash DNA, or if it actually comes from Chumash people, there's absolutely no way of me differentiating if the human DNA is from myself breathing on the sample, the archaeologists taking the samples, or a Chumash person. So I'll have to throw out any human DNA. Oftentimes the human DNA, when you're metabarcoding, is identified as chimpanzee or something because it's that conserved within humans and that closely related to chimpanzees at the region that I'm sequencing.
Thank you. Okay, this next one is, you mentioned the different time scales that the Chumash Elder Council works on versus the time pressures of research, publishing, and so on. How do you see the fields of E&E balancing these different factors as we try to move forward, hopefully more ethical futures?
So this is the first time that I've been kind of at this interface learning about it. And I came in, this is my first postdoc, and it put a kind of 6-month lag on starting a project. And if they weren't interested in the project, that would have been totally fine. We could have done the ecological focused projects, which they were totally fine with. Some people say that the route forward is of this communication starting with kind of later career researchers who have many projects going on, so that it's not putting everything on hold. Some people say that it's not the best place to jump in with early career researchers. I don't know if I totally agree with that, because for me, it's kind of setting that precedent for the rest of my career. But of course, it did have a lag.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And kind of along those lines, do you have any kind of general advice you might give to someone who maybe is juggling with these decisions on maybe they want to work, do a project like this, working with like Indigenous peoples or ancient DNA that might be kind of sensitive data? Do you have kind of any general advice or anything that kind of you wish you would have known getting into this? I know you've worked on projects like this in the past, but
Yeah, so going into this, since my advisor, Dr. Rick, has worked with the tribes his entire career, I was in a great position. I was lucky to be able to kind of have that insider's intel about what to do. The resource that I put on my resources page that you can look back to in the YouTube video is a great resource that I didn't know about actually until last week. And I wish I had known about that resource. I gave this talk as a practice talk to my lab, and they showed me that resource, and I was amazed that I didn't know about it. So maybe start with that resource.
okay, cool, thank you. So this next question is, thank you so much, Dr. Shirazi, so interesting. There's two questions. The first one is, with eDNA, what sort of resolution are you able to attain? Species level genetic information versus population level? Does this change with the age of the DNA? And the second question is, how do Dr. Rick and yourself resolve the potential conflict between the short time scale of postdoc position and the time scales of working with the tribe and then conducting the research?
Okay.
I can read either one of those again if you need me to. That was a lot. Yeah.
I'll start with the first one because I can see that one. Oh, it's all in one. Okay, resolution of environmental DNA data. When you extract the DNA, all of the DNA, well, how do I explain this? When you're doing metabarcoding, where you're just targeting individual genes, there's just kind of the species level resolution. You can't look at population level information. And even further than that, species versus genus versus family resolution depends on the gene that you choose. So there's resources everywhere online. When you're choosing a gene, it will give you some metric like this gene or metabarcode gets down to the species level for 70% of target organisms or something like that. So you can choose a gene. And actually, the bigger the gene is, like physically, the more nucleotides in the gene, the more resolution it will generally have. But when you're working with ancient DNA, the DNA is all broken up. So you need to target smaller genes that might not have a species level resolution, but they'll have a genus level. In terms of population level research, that's kind of a frontier in environmental DNA that people are trying to work with more modern samples, not doing metabarcoding, doing what's called shotgun sequencing, where you don't target special or individual genes, you sequence everything. So that's a movement right now. The field isn't there yet, but many researchers are trying to get towards that with environmental DNA. And how do we resolve the potential conflict between short time scale of a postdoc position and the time scales of working with a tribe?
Yeah, I think that was very similar to one of the previous questions. We may have,
yeah,
cover that, unless you have any other thoughts. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, that looks like all of the questions in the Q&A. So I think we're right on time, and I think yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Shirazi. That was really, great experience. Thank you so much for being here today and that talk. And with that, I will turn it over to Susanna Campbell, who will introduce our next speaker. So thank you again, Dr. Shirazi.
Hi, everyone. So thanks for chiming in for our third week of ECSS. Today, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Karen Bailey. Dr. Bailey joins us today from the Environmental Studies Department of UC Boulder. Prior to Boulder, she completed her PhD in 2018 at the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at the University of Florida. At UF, she was initially going to study small mammal communities in a mosaic landscape in Swaziland, But when she got there, she evaluated her research perspective and realized her true passion was studying human-environment interactions and human natural systems. This remains the focus of her research at UC Boulder. Her work literally breaks international barriers as she works with communities in Southern Africa, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, just to name a few. She has a very successful publication record that includes several recent articles on DEIJ, specifically in our EEB communities. From learning about her research, it's clear to see that DEIJ is embedded in every aspect of her research program. So I'm excited to hear her speak today about her career and how she's developed it into a very socially conscious program. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thanks for inviting me and having me here. I'm really honored to share the virtual stage with Dr. Shirazi. Really enjoyed your talk. So today I'm going to be touching on this idea that's really at the core of my work, which is centering our humanity. And I'll discuss a little bit more about what I mean there in ecology and environmental studies and related fields to support inclusion, justice, and equity, and those sort of related principles that underlie it. This work and some of the research and findings and thinking and conceptualization of this work is in collaboration with lots of individuals and organizations who I'd like to acknowledge at the top here. And this is not the full list, there are many others. So I would like to start my talks with a land acknowledgement. I honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado Boulder campus, which is where I'm currently right now, is on the traditional territories and ancestral homeland of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. Further, I acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that now comprise what is now called Colorado. Acknowledging that we live in the homeland of Indigenous peoples recognizes the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. And with this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples and recognize the knowledge systems Indigenous peoples have developed in relationship to their lands. I further recognize and affirm the ties these nations currently have to their traditional homelands and acknowledge the painful history of oppression, marginalization, land dispossession, and forced removal that has had a profoundly negative impact on Native nations. I think we've already sort of done a lot of work in this talk to establish why land acknowledgements are important. I also think it's worth noting that they are literally the bare minimum. And so I include this, but I'm also thinking a lot about my research, its impacts, my positionality, what the university is doing, and how we're supporting Native scholars and Native communities as well. So starting there. So for this talk, I'm going to be discussing a little bit of the sort of historical context that drives my research, some of my actual research on inequity in STEM and natural resource fields. So a lot of my research really considers the historical framework and historical positions that have led to the lack of diversity and inclusion in STEM and natural resource fields. As we've already been discussing, the history of Western science has largely been exploitative and sometimes often damaging to marginalized communities, including communities of color and Indigenous communities. And a lot of those structures remain when we do science today. And this can range from sort of the slightly more mundane, and I think this article, and I say mundane, but the reality is for folks who do have names that don't conform to the sort of forms that we have to fill out in our day-to-day lives, this becomes significantly more than mundane. So this article published in Nature column really just acknowledges that some people only have one name, or some people have two last names, for example. And again, these sort of soul cultures and backgrounds and traditions by which we have structured systems in STEM fields make it hard to apply for grad school, apply for grants, write publications, et cetera. So it can range from sort of these to more sort of systemic, broad scale trends, including particularly in ecology and related fields, the prevalence of unpaid positions that many early career scholars are expected to take in order to be successful in the field. So this figure here is from recent research that we just got published, looking at the relationship between unpaid positions and success in wildlife related fields in particular. And what we found from some of that work is that in addition to barriers to participation for people of color, non-traditional students, those with disabilities, those with families, people with less wealth, right, to take unpaid positions. But there's also some differences in the actual skills that people report gaining from unpaid positions. So ultimately, we might be doing a disservice to all with the prevalence of these positions. Another example that I think is important to highlight in terms of structural biases that are legacies in science is the reinforcement or the potential reinforcement of the invisibility of certain groups, regions, demographics, populations and this is particularly focused on climate change research and how that has implications for climate policy. So this work shows how bias at the level of institutions where we decide to fund research and where we don't decide to fund research, for example, in research design, in data collection methods, in data analysis, for example, removing outliers, deploying a survey in one language and not providing it for access in other languages, can make it so that certain groups are ignored. And when we're developing strategies to address things like climate change and climate resilience, it doesn't necessarily include those who might be especially vulnerable. So these are just a few examples that are highlighting kind of at the highest level some of the structures or examples of the structures that we've been researching that can lead to persistent inequity in STEM fields. So these sources of bias in science have lots of implications, but an important one is that in general, people of color are less likely to receive degrees in STEM fields in this country. And so this figure here shows the total number of doctoral degrees awarded in STEM fields by race and ethnicity from 2000 to 2015. And again, it's not scaled for population size, so it's not proportioned here. That's important to note, but it's also clear that the trends haven't changed significantly over the 15 years that this data was collected. And as I'm sure many who are with us today also know that these trends extend in particular to not only the academic realm, but also to practitioners and other peoples in particularly environmental fields. And so this is some work from Dorcita Taylor and the Green 2.0 project. And I would encourage you, if you're curious about this, to go and look at the Green 2.0 website. They're specifically focused on environmental organization, NGOs, government agencies, and foundations. And they have these really valuable transparency report cards for these organizations that look at what they're doing and what they're not doing as it relates to inclusion and diversity. And so this figure particularly shows how the representation or the level of representation of people of color tends to decline pretty rapidly as you move from interns to staff hired in the past 3 years to leadership to board slots. And so obviously this has implications for what all of these organizations prioritize in terms of research and action surrounding environmental issues. So given this lack of diversity in ecology and related fields and the experiences that many people of color and ecologists of color face today, many of my colleagues wanted to better understand how the origins of environmental fields influence how we do science in ways that may lead to exclusion. So this figure here is a draft graphic from a recently accepted article that criticizes the North American model of wildlife conservation. Which, despite the sort of many accomplishments of the model, and I fully acknowledge that it has been successful in conserving wildlife across the country and elsewhere in the world, many have argued that the origins of the environmental movement have created and sort of couched in this North American model have created structural and cultural barriers and that ultimately kind of center only one type of relationship with the environment, and so one type of perspective as it relates to conservation, and often overlooks many of the ways that diverse and underrepresented cultures and communities might conceptualize conservation or think about more robust and nuanced ways of having a relationship with the environment or conserving it. And so we particularly highlight the exclusion of Indigenous science, the exclusion of other types of relationships with nature, the tendency to disregard the narratives of communities of color in terms of relationships with the environment that influences the sort of makeup of the field today. These origins of the environmental movement here in the United States have also persisted and been exported to lots of other countries and other contexts where some of our approaches to science, ecology, and conservation disenfranchise and marginalize certain communities. Things like fortress conservation, again, are separating people from their environment and excluding other ways of thinking about conservation and natural resource management. And then there's sort of the fraught history of traditional field science that sort of still persists in the way we do scientific research today, where foreigners might come into communities and ultimately engage in knowledge that without benefiting local communities or considering things like data sovereignty, which Dr. Shirazi was discussing, that are really important. And so there are these tensions between the way that we've engaged in science historically and this really important goal of conservation and sustainable natural resource management that have excluded certain groups and have been damaging and harmful to those groups as well. And so this figure is a particular topic of conservation refugees, which, you know, the term could certainly be debated, but looks at the reality that displacement and land dispossession are often at the core of some of our approaches to conservation. So given the realities of some of the origins of our field and the way that certain inequities might persist in the structures within our field, unsurprisingly, perhaps, many ecologists of color have trouble entering and persisting in these fields. And even if we are able to be recruited in these fields, once we're here, the spaces can often feel unsafe and unwelcoming. And so as part of our ongoing research with environmental scientists and conservation of color, we're doing more to learn more and to center and amplify these experiences to ultimately improve these structures. So I wanted to share with you a quote from a recent article we published about a student's experience, an early career student's experience conducting ecological field research. The word was only said once, but it echoed in her ears. She heard stories of the word thrown at her, including her parents, but the word was never used towards her, the N-word. It felt like a punch to the gut. She looked around to her peers and saw blank faces. She immediately began to question her decisions regarding work. Is this my new normal? Can I survive the field season when so much pain was inflicted on the first day? She thought back to her childhood, watching Steve Irwin on television with an infectious smile and bright optimism. She dreamt of being like him, traversing the outdoors to see all of the wondrous animals. Yet Steve Irwin did not look like her, nor did her peers. So this is an important and relatively extreme, but also definitely not example from a scientist who on the first day is conducting ecological field research and experiencing this level of discrimination and being surrounded by peers that aren't stepping up, aren't supporting her, and is really making her question whether or not this is a field she wants to remain in. And many people of color I know and work with have experienced overt and explicit racism and micro and macroaggressions in the field simply because they existed while doing their science. And so what we're finding through this research is that many people of color have these similar experiences linked to discrimination, isolation, ridicule, and exclusion. They may not be called a racial slur, though many are, but maybe it's presumed that they were hired only because of their race or that they don't have the same skills and capacity as their peers. And we're finding that often one of two things seem to happen. Either they leave and go somewhere else where they aren't likely to be the only one, or where they won't be seen as just a diversity hire, for example, or they stay and often feel an overwhelming burden to fix things. They feel the need to take on the task of making the experiences for those that come after them better. And some of the people we've interviewed for this work have described feeling like a martyr for the cause of equity in STEM fields. So what can we do? And how can we move forward? In the context of this structural racism in STEM fields in general, my soapbox and what sort of drives the title of my talk is one of bringing our humanity back into our science. And when I say humanity, I mean ourselves, our identities, and our values. So this figure here, let me show you, is from a recent study of grant funding from the National Institutes of Health. And it found that Black scientists were 20% less likely to receive funding from the NIH than white scientists, and that this gap was largely explained by the types of research questions pursued. So figure A here shows that Black scientists were more likely to propose research that focused on people, communities, populations, interventions. And figure B shows topic clusters that didn't have applications from African American or Black scientists. And I think there's an important question there as to why Black scientists might not be researching those questions. But as it relates to sort of this discrepancy in funding, what we saw here from this work is that Black scientists saw this humanity in their work. They sought to understand health disparities, patient-focused interventions, challenges for adolescent healthcare. And unfortunately, consistently, review panels viewed such research as less impactful and less worthy of funding, leading to this 20% discrepancy in funding. This bias towards quote unquote impactful research that lacks explicit humanity and explicit consideration of the social, political, economic, historical processes and systems that influence health and well-being impacts the way we teach science and how science is viewed more broadly. And so as a result, people, literally people, are often less likely to be represented in textbooks, in widely shared research articles. It means that budding scientists are unlikely to see themselves and their communities when they learn about science. And for me personally, this manifested as growing up wanting to be an ecologist and understanding the environment, but rarely seeing myself and my communities represented in ecology and environmental science. I ultimately obtained 2 degrees with the word ecology in them before learning that people and the environment meant more to me than just the environment. And so for so long, my learning had to focus on ecology and the environment in such a way that I couldn't see myself in my communities. And again, those social processes and historical processes that play a critical role in our understanding of the environment and our solving environmental challenges. And so infusing humanity into our science means sort of normalizing and valuing the role that our identity and our lived experiences can play in our work, so that future scientists can really embody their work and feel more included in STEM and conduct research that is beneficial for sort of the environment and people. And so this was mentioned in my introduction, but for me, this kind of manifested as doing research on rodents in Southern Africa, and then having to kind of shift gears and pivot and realize that I wanted to study the drought that was going on and the communities that were being affected by it, in addition to the ecological landscapes as well. I was able to make that shift, and so that's the sort of work that I do now, that I aim to do with my research. And I consistently attempt to push back against the structures that encourage us to leave people out of the equation and bring humanity in my work, and acknowledge really these overt processes that have led to the current state of affairs. And I think this can take many forms, but is broadly aimed, and my work is aimed at linking our histories and our identities to our current lived realities and societal conditions, and really the science to bring them all together and to answer questions in more robust and I think inclusive ways. And so I'll provide a little more specific examples. For my research, this really means looking at human environment interactions with the intersecting goals of conservation and human well-being. And so I specifically prioritize research that examines social organizations, collective actions, and the efforts of local communities and community organizations, and how they are acting within their areas and conservation landscapes to minimize or mitigate things like human-elephant conflict in some contexts and human-wildlife conflict in other contexts. And to think about sort of how we can manage landscapes that are important for conservation, but also important for human health and well-being. And so I think by actively researching these social processes that influence ecological processes and conservation outcomes, I have more of an opportunity to identify intersectional issues in my research, think critically about equity throughout the research process, and it also helps me to search for solutions, I think, that benefit both people and the environment. Another way that I approach this idea of bringing humanity in my work, and I think it touches on a lot of some of the things that Dr. Shirazi was talking about as well, is the importance of recognizing my positionality and the sources of privilege that I have when I'm doing my research. I do a lot of work in countries in Africa and Asia, as was mentioned in the introduction. And this is a map that shows the countries that have been under European control and kind of just reminding us all of the colonial legacy that exists globally. And so when I'm doing work in those places and in those contexts, I, as an American, I occupy a very different positionality than I do here in the US. There, I'm grappling with these legacies of oppressive colonial histories and science in particular, these practices of knowledge theft, and really the explicit use of science to oppress at times. And so for me, bringing our humanity into my research means that I actively and openly acknowledge my privilege. And again, to some of the questions that were asked of Dr. Shirazi, the existing scientific structures that I work in, for instance, the average length of a PhD, the duration of a grant cycle, or this conflict, for instance, between what a university values, publications, and what local communities values, which might be often something quite different. So that these structures that I work in are not necessarily made for me to push back against these existing colonialist structures and the impacts of them. But at the sort of, again, at the minimum, acknowledging that to those around me, expressing that to local communities that I'm hoping to work with is a way for me to kind of remove the guise of complete objectivity and this idea that there's not this human component to the work, and recognize the myriad of ways that my science can impact people, potentially both positively and negatively, right? And so part of my strategy with this, I know a few people were asking about sort of how you reconcile like the time frame of a postdoc to the reality that working, for instance, with Indigenous communities can and should take a lot of time, right, to do it in a way that's equitable and just. And so part of my strategy is to make sure my work is responsive to the needs of local communities and it's not extractive, is to work with organizations that already are on the ground and have had relationships with local communities, have a better understanding of local needs and interests, and a history of service to the community so that I can enter the space as an academic with sort of resources and a particular sort of skill set, but be of service in the work that I do. And so these are some of the organizations that I started working with or hoping to work with in an effort to strengthen the impact and the responsiveness and the adaptability of my research, and really meaningfully address my positionality and my privilege in my work. The other way that I primarily try to push back against some of these legacies of oppression that are baked into the way we do science is the way that I teach and the way that I learn. So I consistently bring humanity into my work and acknowledge these processes as it relates to things like environmental injustice, oppression, and the ways that science has been used to oppress in the past. So for instance, in my, I teach a course, intro course on environmental studies. It's a very large intro course, 350 students. And so we have lots of opportunity to talk about, ecological processes, for example, and trends in waste management or energy, right? But we also have lots of opportunities to talk about, justice, for example. And so in one instance, we were teaching students about some simple statistical or relatively simple statistical approaches like regressions and chi-squared tests. And, we paused and took time in that class to note the history of the statistical tests and the reality that they were used and often developed by early statisticians to promote racist ideals, right, about head size, for example, to fuel Nazi propaganda. And really the idea with acknowledging the history of these statistical tests wasn't, don't use the tests. It's math, it's usable. We can and should be using statistical tests, but to think about how science has been used to oppress in the past and how it may continue to do so, and to encourage students to look at those histories and then acknowledge and mitigate any potential bias or positionality that are linked to those histories when they're doing science and addressing environmental issues. So just highlighting a few of, I think, the relevant articles of interest here in my efforts to kind of explicitly address this idea of justice and equity and diversity and accessibility and inclusion and belonging and responsibility and all of these related principles in STEM. I've worked on several projects directly with other conservationists and environmentalists of color. And these were all published in the last few years. And I think it's really worth noting that there's a growing interest in articles like these and research that is explicitly developing kind of usable and valuable ways of thinking about inclusion in these fields. And this is obviously in direct response to George Floyd being murdered and the associated kind of civil rights and Black Lives Matter movement that have encouraged all institutions everywhere, most of them, many of them, to think about equity in their work. And so I think it's important that while lots of people, including myself included, have been doing this work for a very long time, there is currently an increasing interest in it as well. So the work that underlies them, our aim is to listen and learn from each other while sharing our experiences in a way that's inclusive and minimizes the sort of emotional labor involved with a broad audience. And I think this supports our overall goal, which is more inclusive and equitable science, and for science to explicitly acknowledge the ways that it has had negative impacts in the past. And so to me, this is really at the core of my research. And it's this idea that when we see our communities and our values in our work and in our science, we see ourselves, and we're able to bring more passion, commitment, and joy to our work. And we can do better, more inclusive science to help us all adapt to a changing globe. We can think about ecological challenges, and we can think about social challenges in ways that are much more inclusive. The other thing that I think I'm actively doing in the context of my research is community building and professional development for students of color, women in STEM, through my work with various organizations, some of which are listed here. And I think, again, that's important as well. This idea of the sort of scientist activist is an important one, and is something that we can all, I think, be bringing explicitly into our work. Yeah, I think that's the point I want to make here. So I might be a little under time here, so I'm happy to spend some time answering questions or talking a little bit about how I incorporate this into some of my research projects. But I just wanted to end here. The other sort of soapbox that I have is the importance of honoring the whole person. I think that there's been a history of kind of dehumanizing and removing people from science. And I think that's part of the reason why our fields are lacking in diversity and feel like they're lacking in exclusivity as well. So fun facts about me to remind you that I'm a scientist and I do work on Jedi issues, but I'm also a person that does other fun things. So I've been sort of hosting some version of pub trivia for probably the last 10-ish years or so, and that's something that's important to me. I recently released a podcast called The Creature Connection, which is all about our connection to fictional worlds and fictional creatures. And I work with an organization, and I'm a pod leader of 500 women scientists, and lead lots of activities and fun things for that group as well. So again, just acknowledging that in the context of the research that I do, I'm thinking a lot about the ways in which people have been extracted from science that have led to inequities today. And so I'm very intentionally putting myself back into my science and my work. So with that, I will end and take any questions. And here are just some pictures of some of us doing work to increase equity and inclusion and access to STEM work. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Personally, I think I just need to thank you for doing all the work that you do. You've touched on it, that a lot of the DEIJ work kind of ends up in the hands of people of color and those who are most affected. And so I think from all of us, we have to thank you for leading that cause.
And I do want to just acknowledge that my approach to that, and so again, thinking about the structures that as an academic, right, I have to do X, Y, and Z. And so I've made Jedi a core of my research field, right? I publish now, and so the university has to acknowledge it. And so I think that's an important, it's a strategy that I've taken, and it definitely doesn't work for everybody, but it's a potential way of balancing that reality. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I'll get us started with a question. We do have some questions kind of coming in the Q&A. But first, I just wanted to ask about your collaborations. So you've done a lot of really great work abroad, collaborating with local scientists and the residential communities. Do you have any advice on how to approach building these collaborations as well as maintaining them, especially for long-term field sites?
Yeah, I mean, I do think an important component of it is, and this is sort of that tension between the timescales that all of our, these structures operate, but is the recognition that sometimes things move slowly and they should move slowly. But I think so. Just as a starting point is reaching out to organizations and again, sort of noting the skills and background that you have, and then really asking the question, not even making the assumption that these skills or expertise or research experiences that I have might be relevant in this community, but asking if they are, right? And figuring out the ways in which they might be. Because the reality is, right, I could come up with lots of potential research questions that I think are going to be interesting, but if the communities there don't care or have bias, right, there's a whole sort of a number of potential, or don't have buy-in rather, a number of potential outcomes that are going to be problematic, right? There might be less willingness to participate in research. There might be, if there's any sort of action taken as it relates to like, conservation or natural resource management, for example, there might be active pushback against any of that action. So again, kind of starting with organizations and the other kind of class or group of people that's considered are these boundary spanners, and right, people who might have a foot in academia but also have connections to organizations, or are also doing activism, or also working with NGOs, who can connect you with the right people who have better a better sense of what the relevant questions to be asking are, or the ways in which we should be answering or thinking about these questions. So I think that's sort of the first step, is really coming in with the assumption that you don't know anything, because that's often the case. And again, that you might have a sort of skill set that you gained from your academic and research-based experiences that can be applied, but the ways in which they can be applied are potentially unknown to you. And then thinking about, okay, what does sustainability look like? Are there ways, to one of the questions that were asked, maybe the communities you're working with want to learn the specific research skills that you're, or the tools or field methodologies that you're working on, and maybe there can be some knowledge transfer, again, in a way that sort of thinks about building capacity and the existing local knowledge as well. And then, of course, I think there's the importance of, okay, when something is done, when a project end date sort of comes around, what comes next, right? Are we reporting back? Are we thinking about next steps? Are we bringing communities together? Are we sharing information? And again, none of that's easy to do, but I think that's sort of the ideal that's good to be aiming for.
Great, thank you so much. That was wonderful. So one of our first Q&A questions, we have an attendee who says, great talk. Could you say something about class? Many of our potential students, speaking personally, never saw anyone who looked like our non-university trained parents. Is there an important nexus in the intersection of race and class, and including gender, race, and class?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that I think about a lot. I think class is so interesting because historically it hasn't come up into the conversation, because it's just hard to rally around being poor, even though, right, many of us have had that lived experience, and all of us probably have it somewhere within our family that we can relate to. But it's often sort of sidelined, even though we know it's obviously very important. It's also potentially an important sort of rallying point for people from diverse, right, racial and ethnic backgrounds as well. And then obviously, right, it intersects with race, ethnicity, and gender, and ability, and sexual orientation, and gender, right? All of these other sort of marginalized groups, often because of these systemic issues that we face in this country, are more likely to have less wealth. So obviously class is important. It's often overlooked, and I think it's important to not do that. I also think it's really, really important when I'm doing research internationally. And again, just sort of, I occupy a specific space here as a woman of color in the United States. And when I go somewhere else, right, I'm definitely seen as a woman of color, but like I'm an American, right? And so that has a lot of sort of wealth implications associated with it. So I think there are lots of intersections that are relevant, and I think there's an opportunity for, I think, building collaborations and bringing different groups together around issues of class, particularly as it relates to natural resources, right? There are so many folks who don't have as much wealth, or from lower socioeconomic statuses, who rely on the environment for their livelihoods and well-being, and I think that's an important linkage. as it relates to like the academic setting, right? I don't remember the exact stat, but it is something like, I don't know, 1 in 4 professors has a family member that has a PhD. It's something absurdly high compared to like the rest of the population. And so there is this sort of misrepresentation of what a professor, right, can look like, or what an academic can look like. And I do think that's important to acknowledge that reality, right? Especially, and but again, it's hard, right? I show up in a place and people make an assumption about my race and gender, but they don't know anything about like my socioeconomic background, and bringing that up in an academic setting is just a little bit weirder, right? Same thing potentially with gender identity, although I think we've made lots of progress, for instance, asking for people's pronouns in normalizing that. And then of course, with things like sexual orientation or invisible disabilities as well. So I think all of these things are things that we should be explicit about sharing in ways that feel comfortable, and in sort of these spaces where we're having these discussions, I guess. So not a great answer there, but lots of thoughts.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. Our next question asks, could you share with us how your students have responded to your teaching as you've devoted time to addressing the human and social context of science?
Yeah, I think generally positively. I think so. My approach, because there is the potential for a lot of emotional labor in this work, and I think you can see from the number of sort of graphs and figures and data that I showed in my talk just now, is using data, is relying on data. And so when you see the numbers, and when you can see, so for instance, in my intro environmental studies class, which again covers, we have business majors, and we have environmental studies majors, and we have sociology majors. It's a good opportunity for students from across the campus really to get exposed to environmental topics. And so they're not necessarily coming in with lots of understanding of it, but we cover on waste management. And in that context, we also talk about environmental justice. And the data on environmental justice and the disproportionate exposure of people of color and poorer people and poorer communities to things like air pollution, it's kind of impossible to question it. And we often will present the data in a way that encourages them to come to the conclusion on their own, right? And so here's an article from Science that showed this. What do you think this means, right? And so it doesn't necessarily aggressively force any sort of potentially uncomfortable takeaway from them, although I think it's fine to do that and make students feel uncomfortable at times, but it does sort of allow people to think through the data as well. And so I think that just because to sort of protect myself from the emotional labor of having to convince a room full of 350 people that racism exists, right, I rely on the data to support the conclusions, right, that there is systemic bias that has led to increased exposure of people of color to, air pollution, for example. And I think that approach generally lands well. I think it's important to acknowledge that that's my approach, and it doesn't intentionally incorporate other ways of knowing, right? These stories and narratives that are very important. And I do bring those up in some of my smaller classes, and students tend to be very receptive as well. I often think of, there's a science writer from The Atlantic, Ed Young, who was the first person I heard say this: you can't replace a feeling with a fact. And so I do think it's important for stories and emotion to be a part of the conversation as well. I just sort of choose where to infuse my personal stories or the stories of those that I know in places that feel a little bit more intimate. But generally, I think with those two approaches, the students are positive and receptive to it.
Great. I'll actually follow up with a question. I'm curious a little bit about the demographics of UC Boulder, because specifically U of M is a primarily white institution. So I often wonder, or I'm hesitant in classes when I have very few minority students about bringing these conversations up. It's still definitely not a reason, probably even more of a reason to bring these conversations up. But if you have any advice on how to kind of balance the discomfort for people who are facing these issues every single day versus another part of our population that just needs to learn and be more aware.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I probably don't I don't know if I have a great answer. So in terms of demographics, this is definitely a predominantly white institution. It's also a disproportionately wealthy institution. I forget the numbers, but something like a bizarrely high percentage of the 1% of the US and their students here. Again, I mean, it's Boulder, people like the mountains, they can go skiing, right? There's lots that attracts wealthy people here. So it's, I think, disproportionately white compared to the United States, and also disproportionately wealthy. And so those are important to consider. I think, again, my approach has been to sort of start by leaning on the data. And then I think another approach is, so I think I generally frame the way that I look at environmental issues as us as a society really needing to center the voices of those most likely to be impacted. And often, right, those are people from, people with less wealth, or people of color. It might be indigenous communities. And so there is this sort of race and class component to it. But I will bring in some other examples where it doesn't necessarily align quite as well. And I think a good example is we're working on wolf restoration in the state of Colorado. And when we're thinking about people who might consider themselves anti-wolf, it might be farmers and ranchers, and from a sort of community or demographic that people might not look at me and think that I care about. But they are the ones most likely to bear the negative impacts of living on a landscape with wolves. And so their voices are really, really important in the conversation, and centering them and paying attention to them, I think, are quite important. And so I think that sort of high level goal of centering the most vulnerable can be applied to lots of different contexts, again, in a way that might feel a bit more approachable for folks from sort of a wide range of demographics. And that's one way of thinking about it. The other is sort of relying very heavily on the data to tell the story that might be my lived experience, but I don't necessarily have to draw on my personal background to do it. But yeah, I think it takes practice, and I think there is a level of vulnerability. The one other thing I wanted to add is we just got funding to teach an environmental racism course, which is really exciting. And not many courses are taught on this topic explicitly. And again, it sort of touches on my work looking at the way that systems and the environmental movement as a whole have been sort of oppressive to communities of color. And there are going to be some tough conversations potentially had in that class, but the person who's teaching it has experience at this university with these demographics teaching, and has had practice kind of leading up to that. So I think that's important as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to integrating those in my own teaching. So our final question here is, what are the current activities of the Black Ecology section in ESA at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. We're sort of trying to get back on track after, I think, being a little bit derailed by pandemic, which is the world's experience. We are currently planning something for Juneteenth, and then I think the probably most exciting series of activities are going to be happening at the upcoming ESA conference in Montreal. And so we'll have a few different panels that have been specifically organized and are showcasing research by members of the Black Ecology section. And then we'll have several events as well. We're also going to be working on a sort of Black Ecologist of the Week on Twitter and on the web page. So we'll be sharing basically like a Google form for people who want to be featured to share their work, share their experiences, et cetera. And so those are kind of the main things. And we're also thinking about professional development, other approaches to community building. I would absolutely encourage you to connect either on the ESA website or email me directly if you'd like to learn more about all the things we've got going on.
That's great. So specifically for the activities you have coming up, are there ways that the broader community can support you and the Black ecologists?
I mean, come to our panels at ESA, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we're gonna have a few different events, and I think that the panels in particular, so that there's this important balance between sort of talking about our lived experiences about as Black ecologists, but also amplifying our research, right? We're doing lots of great research, and there's also that's also an important component. So I think that's important as well. I think we might be soliciting donations at some point, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. If
you.
there aren't any final questions, I think we can wrap up our session for today. Again, Dr. Bailey, thank you so much. This was a really wonderful conversation. Also, thank you, Dr. Shirazi. We've been really fortunate to have so many wonderful scientists able to present with us today and for the next, or throughout this month. Thank you.
Yeah, so please join me in thanking our speakers, Dr. Sabrina Shirazi and Dr. Karen Bailey. So next Friday, we'll conclude our symposium where we'll be having an anti-racism panel discussion with Dr. Nick Rio, Dr. Robin Clark, and Dr. Katie Kamalama. As a reminder, if you're not already registered for the symposium, please do so that we have numbers that accurately reflect the amount of participation that we've had. And again, we thank you all for attending and we look forward to seeing you next week.